Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're tackling a really big question, one that's kind of fundamental in psychology. How do we actually learn and develop? Is it, mostly something we build inside ourselves, or is it more about soaking up what's around us in our environment?
Exactly. It's this long-standing debate. And to really get a handle on it, we're diving into a specific commentary by David Moshman. He's looking at the work of someone named Elbers.
Right. This piece is from the Educational Psychology Review back in '91, and it focuses right on this issue, specifically within the development of logical thinking.
Yeah, what's interesting, as you said, is Moshman isn't necessarily coming out and saying Elbers is wrong. It's more like he's pushing the idea further. He's really zeroing in on this concept of universal developmental sequences.
So, like, are there certain steps in logical reasoning that everyone goes through, no matter their culture or upbringing?
Precisely.
Okay, so for everyone listening, our mission today is basically to unpack this core tension. We want to understand Moshman's challenge here. Are these milestones in logic sort of hardwired, or are they entirely shaped by society?
Okay, so let's start with the sort of traditional view, the old dichotomy. For a long time, you basically had two camps, right?
Hmm.
One camp really believed knowledge is something we actively construct. It happens inside our own heads. Think of a kid figuring out building blocks. They're the ones making the connections.
Right. So education, from that view, is about supporting that internal building process.
Yeah. And then the other camp saw it differently. More like we absorb information and skills from the world, like a sponge maybe,
Hmm.
or a plant taking in sunlight.
Okay. So education, there is more about transmitting knowledge, a teacher explaining something.
Exactly. But what's happened over time, especially with newer ideas like information processing theories,
Mhm.
Vygotsky, neo-Piagetians,
Right. Those came along.
is that we've started to see it's much more complex. It's not really either internal construction or external absorption. It's a really intricate interaction between the two,
And back and forth.
a constant interplay. Yeah. Simple either or just doesn't quite cut it anymore.
But, Moshman makes a good point. It's one thing to say it's an interaction, but it's actually really hard to build theories that truly reflect that complexity.
Totally. It's easy to end up leaning heavily one way or the other, even if you claim it's interactionist. You might have a theory that's fundamentally Piagetian focused on internal stages, but it just, like, tips its hat to the environment.
Or the opposite, an environmentalist theory that gives a quick nod to the mind being active, but really focuses on external factors.
Exactly. So this is where Moshman comes in with his really pointed question. Are there universal sequences in human development? Specifically, he's asking about logical reasoning. Is there a predictable path we all follow, more or less?
Okay, so let's break down the two main possibilities he discusses. First, there's the Piagetian view. What does that suggest about universality?
Well, the Piagetian perspective generally says, yes, there are universal sequences. The idea is that these sequences happen because our minds are naturally driven towards what Piaget called equilibrium.
Equilibrium,
Yeah.
like a more balanced, sophisticated way of understanding things.
Yeah, exactly. It's like our thinking naturally progresses towards more stable and effective structures.
Okay. And how does that contrast with the other main view, the socialization perspective?
The socialization view really emphasizes culture. It argues that how we develop, what we learn, even how we think, it's all fundamentally shaped by our specific cultural context.
So development isn't necessarily universal then, it's more relative to the culture.
That's the core idea, yeah. Developmental paths can look quite different depending on the society.
So Moshman then asks, what would a truly interactionist theory look like? He explores two possibilities, right? Starting with a developmental interactionist view.
Right, a truly developmental interactionist view, he suggests, would argue that certain sequences are actually necessary. Like climbing a ladder, you have to take step one before step two.
So the order is fixed.
The order is fixed, yeah.
Yeah.
Each step logically proceeds and enables the next one. Now, the environment still matters. It can affect how fast you climb the ladder, maybe even if you reach the top rung.
But the sequence of rungs itself is constant because there's this inherent drive towards, say, greater rationality.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's the developmental lean. Now, contrast that with a truly environmentalist interactionist view.
Okay, what does that look like?
This perspective would say that while, yes, our minds actively construct knowledge, what gets constructed depends entirely on the environment you're interacting with.
So no fixed sequence here.
Nope. The direction of development isn't predetermined. It's shaped by social context language, cultural values, common ways of seeing things. Development is relative.
Right. And I think we can all agree that a lot of our behavior and knowledge is socially contextual. What's polite, what skills matter, that varies hugely.
Absolutely. The idea that knowledge is partly relative makes perfect sense. But Marshman keeps pushing back to that core question. Are there any universals, any necessities in development that aren't totally culturally relative?
And this is where he proposes his specific sequence for logic, right? This is the heart of his commentary.
Yes, this is where it gets really interesting. He lays out a potential four-stage universal sequence for logical reasoning development. Stage one, he says, starts in infancy.
Infancy. Wow.
Yeah.
How does logic show up then?
At a sensoromotor level.
Yeah.
He talks about basic inference schemes applied through action. He cites Langer's work here.
Okay, like the example he gives, the baby and the toy.
Exactly. The toy is either under blanket A or blanket B. Baby looks at her A, it's not there. Then immediately goes for B.
So that action shows an understanding of either not A, therefore B.
That's the argument. It's an implicit form of disjunctive reasoning demonstrated through behavior.
Okay, that's fascinating.
And he notes other studies suggesting preschoolers might also implicitly use these schemes, maybe in solving simple verbal problems. And he mentions arguments, like from Brain and Roumain, that these basic schemes might reflect underlying logical necessities, not just things learned from language or culture.
So a kind of foundational logic.
That's the idea. So Marshman suggests that typically humans in any culture progress from this very practical, action-based logic.
At stage 2.
Yes, stage two.
Yeah.
Applying these same inference schemes, but now at a representational level. Thinking about them, not just acting them out.
Makes sense. Moving from doing to thinking. What's stage 3?
Stage three, he suggests, happens around age 5 or 6. This is where metacognitive reflection kicks in.
Metacognitive. Thinking about thinking.
Basically, yes. Kids start realizing that inference itself is a distinct way of gaining knowledge. They begin to differentiate things that must be true logically from things that are just social rules or things they've observed usually happen.
So they're not just using logic, they're starting to grasp what logic is.
Exactly. They recognize logical necessity as something different from empirical regularity or social convention. He points to work by Sodian and Wimmer and Somerville et al. Supporting this shift.
That seems like a really crucial step.
It does. And Moshman suggests that while cultures might differ in, say, how many people really master this or the exact age it happens, the fundamental ability to recognize logical necessity is probably universal.
Okay. So sensor-motor logic, then representational logic, then recognizing logical necessity. What's the fourth stage?
Stage four, he proposes, emerges maybe around 11 or 12, and this is important only for some individuals in some cultures. This is the ability to understand the validity of a formal argument purely based on its structure, regardless of its content.
This is where the elephants example comes in.
Yes, the classic. If elephants are animals or plants, and elephants are not animals, then elephants are plants.
Right. Logically, the argument works, even though the conclusion is factually absurd.
Precisely. Someone at stage four can appreciate the logical soundness of the form, separating it entirely from the real-world truth of the statements. Moshman and Frank's work is relevant here.
And he stresses that this stage isn't necessarily universal.
Right. He explicitly states that reaching this level of abstract formal reasoning likely depends quite a bit on cultural emphasis and educational experiences. Not everyone gets there.
Okay, that's a pretty detailed proposed sequence. Now, knowing these debates, what counter-arguments does Moshman anticipate Elbers might raise?
He anticipates several. He thinks Elbers might stress the importance of knowing when to apply logic. Having the tool isn't enough. You need the judgment to use it appropriately.
Context matter.
Context matters, exactly. Elbers might also focus on how logic skills are taught, the specific procedures learned, and crucially, the role of culture in actively encouraging or discouraging logical reasoning.
So cultural factors could significantly affect the rate and maybe even the final level of development reached, even if the underlying sequence exists.
That seems to be what Moshman is considering Elbers might argue. It's not just about innate capacity, but also about the environmental scaffolding and encouragement.
Makes sense. So how does Moshman kind of wrap this up? Where does he leave the debate?
Well, he tries to frame the core difference. He basically says, look, if Elbers acknowledges that some deductions are logically necessary and that there's a kind of natural developmental progression towards better reasoning and reflecting on logic itself,
All right.
then Elbers' view is fundamentally developmental, even if it gives a huge role to cultural influence shaping the pace and specifics.
So a developmental core with cultural variations layered on top.
Right. But Moshman continues, if Elbers believes that logic is entirely constructed through language, culture, social interaction, with no inherent direction or necessary sequence,
Yeah.
then his view is fundamentally environmentalist. The environment isn't just influencing the path, it's creating the path. It dictates the course of logical development.
So it boils down to, is logic fundamentally discovered as we mature, or is it entirely invented by culture?
That seems to be the crux of it, yeah. And Marshman ends his commentary by saying he's genuinely curious how Elbers would respond to this framing. He leaves the reader and now us kind of hanging, waiting for Elbers' clarification on whether he sees any necessary universal stages in logical development.
Wow. Okay. So, wrapping up our deep dive today, we're left really contemplating this dynamic interplay, this tension between potentially universal structures in how our minds develop logic and the undeniable shaping power of our specific social and cultural worlds.
Yeah, it really highlights that even if there are universal foundations, the environment plays such a critical role. It's about activating, nurturing, and shaping how those potentials actually unfold. That
Yeah.
interaction is everything.
So, a final thought maybe for everyone listening. Reflecting on this proposed sequence, infancy, childhood, metacognition, maybe formal logic, and considering your own background, your education, your culture. How do you think your understanding of logic was shaped?
hmm Are there parts that feel innate, universal,
Yeah.
and other parts that feel very much learned, very specific to your experiences?
It's a fascinating question about how we become the thinkers we are, something to mull over. Thanks for diving deep with us.